Every spring, it starts the same way. Fresh soil, tiny tomato plants, a clean garden, and the quiet confidence that this year will be different. For a few weeks, everything looks perfect. Then the weeds come back. You pull them. A few days later, they're back. You pull them again, and somehow, every season begins to feel exactly like the last one. Most gardeners blame the weeds. But that's not the part that should worry you, because by the time weeds become visible, your tomatoes may already be losing water, losing nutrients, losing the harvest they were meant to produce. Quietly, long before anyone notices. And here's the contradiction almost nobody talks about. Some of the healthiest tomato gardens barely fight weeds at all. Not because they have better products, not because they work harder, but because they protect something most gardeners never see. Most gardeners imagine an empty patch of soil. It rarely is. Beneath that clean surface, countless dormant seeds may already be resting in silence. Most will never grow this season. Some may remain hidden for years. They aren't spreading across the garden. They aren't searching for tomatoes. They're simply part of the soil, waiting for the right moment. Many gardeners spend years pulling the same patches, never realizing they're restarting the same story with every handful they remove. So maybe the weeds aren't really coming back. Maybe they've been there all along, waiting for one simple condition, a patch of open ground. And the moment you begin to see the garden that way, the weeds stop looking like invaders and start looking like a quiet response. The problem was never the green shoots. It was the space that invited them. And once that thought settles in, another question quietly appears. If those seeds have always been there, what keeps telling them it's time to grow? At first, it feels like 5 harmless minutes. A handful of weeds, a clean row, dirty gloves, and one small job crossed off the list. Next weekend, you're back in the same place. A few more weeds, another few minutes. Still nothing worth worrying about. Until one morning you stop and notice something strange. You're not winning. You're repeating. And somehow, the tomatoes never seem as strong as they looked in spring. The leaves are still green. The plants are still standing. Everything looks perfectly normal. Except, while you're clearing the surface, something else may already be changing below it. And sometimes, that change is surprisingly small. A vade is pulled. The surface opens. A little more sunlight reaches the ground. To a gardener, it feels like progress. But for some seeds, it can feel like a beginning. Long before another green shoot appears, another competition may already be taking shape. Roots searching for the same water, the same nutrients, the same space. No warning, no dramatic moment, just tiny losses, adding up day after day. And the uncomfortable part? That process often begins when the garden looks its cleanest. So, if a harvest can start changing before you ever notice a single weed, what else has been happening? Right beneath your feet? One hot July afternoon, 2 tomato gardens stood only a few fences apart. One never seemed finished. Every weekend, someone was on their knees, pulling weeds, scraping the soil clean, making every row look neat, safe. The other garden looked almost neglected. A little straw, a few fallen leaves, a few wild plants near the edges. Not the kind of garden that impresses the neighbors. And yet, when harvest season arrived, something didn't make sense. The cleaner garden still needed work. The quieter garden was already filling baskets. The leaves stayed deep green through the hottest afternoons. The vines bent under heavier fruit. The gardener who worked less kept bringing home more tomatoes. If you've spent years chasing perfectly clean beds, this is the part that feels uncomfortable. The difference wasn't dramatic. It was cumulative. One garden kept restarting the same struggle. The other rarely gave it a chance to begin. Day after day, small advantages quietly stacked together. A little more water, a little more space, a little less competition, until those invisible gains became visible harvest. Most people end the story there. The other gardener just got lucky. Except, luck doesn't keep showing up summer after summer. And if the garden demanding less work kept producing more food, maybe the real advantage wasn't what the gardener added. Maybe it was what they stopped doing. Because once you notice that pattern, it's impossible not to ask a harder question. What was the cleaner garden accidentally creating? Every time it looked perfectly maintained? Here is the part most gardeners never stop to question. Nobody walks into a tomato garden hoping to grow weeds. They pull them, drop them into a bucket, brush the dirt from their hands, and stand back. Maybe you've done the same thing. Most of us have. That's why the next part is so easy to miss. A few days later, tiny greens of specks appear in the exact same places. Not enough to ruin the day, just enough to promise more work. And somehow, the cycle starts again. Most people blame stubborn weeds. But what if the weeds aren't the thing repeating? What if we are? Because every time the soil is opened, something changes. A little more light reaches the surface. A place that was covered becomes exposed. To a gardener, it looks clean. To thousands of dormant seeds, it looks different. Until the conditions change. Then the race begins long before another weed becomes visible. Roots searching for water. Roots searching for nutrients. Roots competing with tomatoes before anyone realizes it, which means the harvest can start losing ground. Days or even weeks before the problem appears above the soil. So maybe the real question isn't why weeds keep coming back. Maybe it's this. How many of them only appeared because the garden accidentally gave them a reason to grow? So instead of fighting the weeds, someone changed almost nothing. 2 tomato beds, only a few feet apart. Samisun. Same rain. Same hose. Same pair of tired hands. The first bed followed the routine almost every gardener knows. Freshly cleaned. Every tiny weed removed before it looked like trouble. For a little while, it looked perfect. The second bed almost looked unfinished. A sheet of cardboard. A layer of mulch. And then, it was simply left alone. No chasing every green sprout. No sore knees on Saturday morning. No feeling that the garden had quietly become another job. 30 days later, tiny green shoots were already appearing in the first bed. The second still looked strangely unchanged. 60 days later, one gardener reached for the bucket again. The other reached for tomatoes. By 90 days, even the neighbor walking past the fence would have noticed. One garden still demanded attention. The other seemed content to grow. Most people see that story and reach the same conclusion. The cardboard stopped the weeds. It certainly looked that way, but cardboard was never the real secret. Neither was mulch. The real difference happened in the few inches nobody was watching. The soil stayed covered. The next wave of weeds never had a chance to begin. That's why copying the cardboard doesn't always recreate the result. Most people copy the material. Very few copy the condition. And once you see that, you stop asking how to kill weeds and start asking why they appeared in the first place. For a little while, everything finally feels easier. The mulch is still where you left it. You look across the bed and think, maybe this year I finally figured it out. And that's exactly why this trap is so easy to miss. The first tiny green sprout appears, almost without thinking. Your hand reaches for it, then another, and another, until one afternoon you stand up and realize the old pattern has quietly returned. Not because the mulch failed, not because the weather changed, because the habit never did. And here's what takes years to notice. The most expensive mistake doesn't happen when weeds appear. It happens when the last weed is gone. For one brief moment, it feels like success, except the ground has been opened again. A small patch, easy to ignore. But that's often how the cycle begins. Not with a disaster, with a tiny disturbance repeated often enough to become a habit. And that's why the healthiest gardens often look slightly unfinished, not neglected, protected. Because the goal was never to create perfect soil. It was to stop restarting the same problem. The strange part is, the weeds were never the main character. Not the cardboard, not the mulch, not even all those hours spent pulling. For months, it looked as though the same battle kept returning. Except, nothing was invading your garden. Nature was simply responding. Every time the soil was left open, something ancient recognized an opportunity. A place without cover. A place exposed to sun and rain. A place asking to be protected again. That tiny patch beside the tomato cage, the same corner you cleaned every weekend, was never staying empty. It couldn't. Nature rarely leaves bare ground alone. If one plant disappears, another quietly takes its place. Not to compete with your tomatoes, to cover the soil, to keep it alive. Suddenly, the endless cycle no longer feels like bad luck. It feels inevitable. Every pull, every scrape, every perfectly clean bed restarted the same story. The gardeners who always seemed calmer and weren't working harder. They simply stopped interrupting a process that had been trying to heal itself all along. And once you see weeds that way, the garden becomes strangely peaceful. Not because every weed is gone, because every empty space no longer feels like something that must be conquered. It becomes something that deserves to be protected. This is where many gardeners quietly change an entire season. Not with a new product, not with another weekend of work, with one different habit. The rows don't have to look perfect. A few wild plants near the edges don't ruin the harvest. A layer of mulch doesn't make the garden lazy. It gives the soil permission to rest. And when the soil rests, the tomatoes spend less time competing and more time growing. By late summer, the difference almost tells the story by itself. Golden light settles across the rows. One gardener carries another bucket of weeds. The other carries tomatoes. The basket is heavier than the bucket, and the work is lighter than it used to be. Maybe that was the goal all along. Not to defeat weeds, but to stop creating the conditions they need. The best tomato gardens don't win an endless battle. They quietly prevent one from starting. For the first time, the garden feels like it belongs to you again. You leave a little earlier. Your back doesn't ache quite as much. There is still dirt on your hands, but not another unfinished chore waiting for you. The garden isn't perfect. It's simply peaceful. And somehow, that quiet approach produces more tomatoes than perfection ever did. But here's the part almost nobody expects. Weeds may not be the biggest reason tomato harvests disappear. One ordinary watering habit quietly weakens more tomato plants every summer, long before the first weed has a chance to grow.